Hello and welcome to News Desk. I'm Melissa Chan.
And I'm Pablo Foley Elias.
This week, we're talking about Iran in what may be its most consequential week since the Islamic Revolution of 1979. What happens next? How many more people will the regime be willing to kill for self-preservation? And how many citizens will continue to brave the bullets to topple the autocracy? Plus, what will be the U.S.'s, Israel's, maybe the Gulf countries' potentially critical role in tipping the outcome one way or the other? Those are a lot of questions, and we have two incredible guests joining us very soon today. We'll have journalist and author John Ghazvinian and also Kori Schake with the think tank, the American Enterprise Institute.
And of course, we'll have Cheri Chan, who is seeing what you have to say in the chat and helping to bring in your questions and comments into the discussion.
Yeah, that's right. I will be in the chat talking to you as usual, and please send your questions over and I will forward it to Pablo, and hopefully we'll put it to our experts.
Absolutely. And here are a few comments already from our community post that went up on Tuesday. So plenty coming in. First one here is from one of our viewers who says, $1 is 1 million rial. It's actually more now. No sane person will come in support of the regime unless they're connected to the mullah or paid. Another viewer here, another commenter says, no alternative good choice. That's the advantage for the present regime. And using religion, this is another comment, to govern a country is a recipe for failure. So plenty of comments coming in. And of course, let's not forget that we have our poll question, and this week's poll question is which factor could be key in toppling Iran's clerical rulers? More street protest, pressure from exiled Iranians, US military intervention, the regime will cling to power. So make sure you vote in that, and we'll bring you the results later in the show.
Great. And so if you're just joining us, we are talking about this critical week in Iran and how this crisis in Iran could reshape geopolitics, depending on how things pan out. Let's just dive straight into it and bring in our guest, John Ghazvinian, who is a journalist and author. His book, America and Iran, A History, 1720 to the Present, was selected as a best book by the New York Times. Welcome, John. Thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
First off, I made some notes about what's just happened, a quick update in terms of the latest developments on this rapidly changing story. Official figures from Iran, by the admission of the government themselves, is some 2,000 dead, although rights groups say that number is much higher. CBS News had come out with a piece about 18 hours ago saying that it could be closer to even 20,000. This is, I believe, the sixth day without the internet, with the intention of the regime being expressed that they intend to keep it that way, although there are also some reports of pockets of access. We understand that the streets of Tehran appear to be quieter at the moment, and one of Iran's officials has said that anyone who was arrested on the streets from January 8th onwards is guilty of taking part in, quote, an internal war. So a lot of news developing. John, I don't know if you have anything to add to that. And I'm also curious in terms of what you might have been hearing from people that you know, through secondary sources, or maybe what you're seeing in Farsi that is important for viewers to know about what's happening right now.
No, sure. I think all of us who are watching this situation closely know that it's very difficult to get accurate information out of Iran. Whatever the number killed, it's obviously far more people than we would ever want to see killed. And, there's no question that this is a regime that feels its back against the wall, doesn't have a lot of options. A lot of its traditional forms of leverage that it could rely on over the years have evaporated recently. And, at the same time, it's a regime that is absolutely committed to its own self-preservation. And therefore, I think it's as tragic as it is, it's not entirely surprising that we are seeing quite a bit of bloodshed. If there is a small silver lining, it's, as you reported correctly, protests in the last couple of days seem to have dwindled. Violence and bloodshed seems to have dwindled as well. That doesn't mean that it will not reappear. A lot of the worst violence took place on Friday and Saturday, which are the Iranian weekend. So of course people are back to work to some degree. it's obviously a tense situation. We have to see how it plays out.
John, we've had rounds of protests. We've seen this play out in Iran for many, many years. Of course, the most recent one is the 2022 Woman Life Freedom one that captured so much global attention. I've been hearing from analysts something very interesting over the last few days, which is the implication that this time is different. I'd love your take on that and why that it might be the case or why you disagree with that. It's hard to, of course, predict. We will have the benefit of hindsight perhaps in a few weeks or even a few months. But does this feel different to you?
That, of course, is the big question. And I neither agree nor disagree with that. There's simply no way to know. What I would say is this, that since roughly 2009, with the Green Movement protests, which I was in Iran for, actually, there has been a sort of pattern. Every so often, every couple of years, every X number of months, there are protests of this kind. Sometimes they're economic, sometimes they're about other things, cultural, religious, hijab, women's rights, human rights. Whatever the case, you have a few days of initial euphoria where large numbers of people start to come out onto the streets, and there's a feeling among some of them that this is it, this is different, we all just need to be out here and we'll bring down the regime, if we all kind of come out together. And sometimes these protests go into the thousands, tens of thousands, even hundreds of thousands. But what tends to happen is that after a couple of days, things take a different direction. Now, either because you have hardcore violent elements that decide to set fire to things or overturn police cars or what have you, or because it's not entirely, the regime is not entirely wrong when it says that there are probably foreign saboteurs as well on the ground that sometimes provoke these kinds of situations, or if it's because the regime is taking a very, very hard line and cracking down, shooting into crowds, provoking worse violence. Whatever the case, when that starts to happen, and when large numbers of people, even not so large numbers of people, are being killed or shot out in the streets, those tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of more mainstream kind of euphoric protesters start to ask themselves questions. Do I really want to be out here? Do I want to be risking life and limb? And we start to see the protests both dwindling somewhat in terms of numbers, but also taking a darker, more hardcore, more violent kind of turn, where the people who are still out there are the ones who are kind of fearless and ready to sacrifice themselves and so on. What that does, though, is it gives the regime an opportunity to kind of isolate the most hardcore, most violent protesters from the more mainstream ones, who are much larger in number, usually, it has to be said, but also much more likely to stay at home when things turn ugly. What that then does is it allows the regime to kind of consolidate its power, to sort of crack down on elements that actually a lot of mainstream Iranian society might not be willing to support, and to be able to claim, however rightly or wrongly, to claim that, these are people are rioters, they're thugs, etc. They're just trying to sow disorder and instability, they're foreign elements, blah, 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 then puts them on trials. And then what we see in the weeks and months that follow, once the security situation is stabilized and the internet has reopened and so on, is that the regime tends to offer some concessions. Whether it's not cracking down as hard on hijab or giving out some economic subsidies or whatever it might be, to sort of indicate that it's listening, to appeal to what it perceives perhaps as a silent majority or even a large silent minority that might still support or at least be on the fence. So I know that's a bit of a long-winded explanation, but to say this is the pattern that we've seen over the past 10, 15 years. And every time this happens, people, particularly in the West, ask the question, is this time different? We never know. This time could be different. But the fact is, every time these protests take place, they're more vocal, they're more angry. The regime has its back against the wall even more. And yet, up till now anyway, it has managed to survive.
John, you talked a little bit about the various groups of people who might be out in the streets with those who are much more hard and, sticking it out for longer. So that actually kind of begs the question that Pablo and I were discussing even before the start of the program, which is
essentially the opposition. What is the opposition in Iran? What's the makeup of it? Because is it united? And also, I mean, I think it's best if we focus on Iran first, but also, there's a huge Iranian diaspora as well. And is there much division there as well with within how they view things back home in Iran?
I don't think it's possible to speak about a formal opposition in Iran in the sense that we probably usually mean when we use that word. I mean, there isn't an opposition party or a leader in waiting, that is operating, along the legitimate political machinery of the Islamic Republic. What you do have within Iran's own political system is, of course, differences of opinion, more reformist elements, more hardline elements, more centrist elements. The president of the republic right now comes from, what is sometimes in the past been referred to as a kind of opposition strain. He's a much more reformist figure. And then, of course, he's opposed by people who are much more hardline. So within Iran, there's a much tighter kind of window for operation. I mean, there are a lot of red lines that you have to operate within. And opposition, in the sense that you're talking about, only comes within the parameters of the Islamic Republic's own ruling elite. These protesters, for the most part, from what we can tell, are not really interested in that kind of political conversation. They're shouting about regime change and bringing down the dictator and so on. Now, as for your question about the diaspora, that's a very different and very interesting conversation. The Iranian diaspora is extremely divided. And Iranian society domestically is also quite divided. But in different ways. The diaspora, predominantly those who don't want to see an Islamic Republic, want to see regime change. And by the way, that's not everyone in the diaspora, but it is probably a majority. Have very different ideas about what the outcome should be. And probably the biggest fault line right now is over the former crown prince from the exiled royal family, Reza Pahlavi, and whether he should have any part in this, in any kind of transition to power. That topic is a real kind of hot button, a real hot potato among diaspora exiles. It's the easiest way to provoke arguments.
We actually have a soundbite from the Crown Prince, but before we do that, I know, Pablo, did you have something, or can I go ahead and run that?
It was just a small thing, but I think it's probably best that we run this and then we'll come back to it.
Okay, great. So let's just hear what the Crown Prince said and then follow up a little bit about that, because it's interesting.
The regime faces a severe shortage of forces of repression. The increase in gunfire against the people is not a sign of strength, but of fear of collapse and an accelerated downfall. We will not allow these criminals to spill any more of our young people's blood. We will not give them that chance. We will not retreat. Iran's freedom is near.
And he's also been doing kind of the media circuit, I believe, on Fox News and so on. And I guess my question is, it's very easy for English-speaking media, Western media, to glom onto him and hear what he has to say because he's available and he's there and putting his hands up to do that. But how much, in terms of support, does the royal family have, just given the history, and also, or is this kind of a sideshow that we can't take too seriously? But on the other hand, also hearing that Crown Prince was in Mar-a-Lago area vicinity, not to meet the president, but to talk to somebody. And I'd love your thoughts on that, especially because you work on the history and you have insight on that.
Well, first of all, I think it's important not to refer to him as the Crown Prince. He's the former Crown Prince of Iran, at least for now.
Former Crown Prince. We'll stick to that.
Secondly, the question you ask is a very good one. And of course, it depends on who you talk to. I think it's objectively fair to say he has not led this revolt. He joined, it was a couple days in, it was several days in before he started making some of his statements and calling on people to come out onto the streets in this way or that way. And of course, I think he and his supporters would love to say that he is somehow leading this revolution against the Islamic Republic. That's not true. This is a homegrown domestic uprising against the Islamic Republic. Reza Pahlavi absolutely has his supporters, both within Iran and outside Iran. I would not argue with that. But where you get into areas of disagreement is, to what extent does the Iranian public support the idea of a return to monarchy? My personal view, and I'm not. This is not. There's no way. It's very difficult to get accurate polling data right now in Iran. But my general sense, is that there is a certain level of nostalgia for the monarchy within Iran, but mostly it's, this is people who have no experience with the monarchy. The vast majority of the Iranian public at this point is now too young to remember the Shah's regime in any meaningful way. And we can't shy away from the, very serious human rights abuses of that regime as well. That was a very unpopular regime by the end of its rule, and it was overthrown in a popular revolution. Now, of course, the Islamic Republic is not necessarily something that everybody wanted to see replacing it. But, royal nostalgia is very strong and very emotionally present among the diaspora. I think among the domestic Iranian public, it's easy to see why Reza Pahlavi might, carry a certain level of symbolic clout. My general sense is that if you talk to Iranians, to 10 Iranians, you're going to get 10 different opinions on this. But that generally speaking, most of those opinions are not going to say we want a return to an autocratic absolutist monarchy, and the Shah's son to return to things exactly the way they were in the 1970s. You might get some people who would say we would like a constitutional monarchy where Reza Pahlavi is a sort of figurehead, but doesn't actually rule. He simply reigns, which is exactly the advice that was given to his father back in 1952, 53 by his former prime minister, Mohammad Mossadegh, who was overthrown by the CIA. But better late than never. Let's have a constitutional monarchy where, the government is allowed to kind of get on with things, but we have a sort of symbolic figurehead. But you may also get quite a lot of other Iranians who will say, no, we don't want any, this guy's a clown. He hasn't lived in Iran since, in 47 years. He was, if I'm not mistaken, 17, 18 years old when he went into exile. That is the kind of spectrum of opinion you might get within Iran.
There's something I just want to go back to, John, because before we heard from the what do we call him? The former Crown Prince.
Yes.
Was this issue of the concessions. I think that's quite an interesting element to kind of look at in a little bit more detail because, it's often used, right, in, we'll say, authoritarian systems. You give people a little bit and then hope that that is going to sort of be enough. But of course, there have been, as you mentioned, so many protests in Iran over the past, 10, 15 years. And there has been a little bit more, we'll say, some more freedoms for people on a sort of very, day-to-day level. But was that a misstep, do you think, of this regime in many respects, that they didn't read that people are not going to be satisfied with providing these, very sort of superficial changes to people's lives?
I don't know that it's a misstep so much as it is. They don't have a lot of other strategic options. From the perspective of the regime, and this is not, you don't have to like the regime, but from their perspective, their feeling is, over the past 20, 30 years, as their unpopularity has increased, and as people have become more and more fed up, they've tried different approaches. They've tried to support or to allow certain concessions. What they have found is that sometimes either outside forces or inside forces push the regime beyond the point that it's comfortable, that they actually use those kinds of concessions as an opportunity to push for something much more fundamental that might bring down the entire edifice. And then they kind of collectively freak out and sort of say, no, this has gone too far, and there's a sort of backlash. Or they've tried to crack down in a very authoritative way, but that creates a different kind of backlash, as we're seeing now. Of course, that just makes people more angry and more disillusioned and more fed up with the regime. It doesn't have a lot of great options. The fact is that the Islamic Republic is deeply isolated internationally. It has a lot of external enemies. And of course, you could make the argument that that's through fault of its own, that it has large numbers of external enemies and that it doesn't have a lot of friends in the world. But whatever the case, this is where they are. So they're going to be nervous about a process of kind of slow, gradual reform, of perestroika, glasnost kind of style of reform, because they know where that leads. They know that that's going to be taken advantage of either both by internal and external forces to bring about a sort of velvet revolution, and to completely bring them down completely. That's the sort of conundrum that they've found themselves in again and again. And as the more time goes on, the more it becomes a zero-sum game, where there isn't a middle ground. And I think those who are cheering on or hoping for regime change, I think actually this is probably their strongest reason for optimism, is that the more time goes on, the more the regime is out of answers. It simply doesn't have a lot that it can offer other than repression. And especially over the last year or two, it's now lost a lot of its international leverage as well in terms of its support for regional militias, both in Palestine and Lebanon. I mean, it doesn't have a lot of those kinds of leverages that it can use against some of its enemies. Its nuclear program, which is another one of its major forms of international leverage, has been bombed, and kind of taken back in time in a lot of ways. And of course, domestically, it's become more and more unpopular, particularly, and we ignore the economic side of this. I mean, these latest round of protests were brought about by a currency crisis and inflationary issues, which have been a long-standing problem for the Iranian population. There are a lot of people in Iran who, frankly, don't care that much about things like human rights or hijab or whatever, but are really sick and tired of not being able to put food on their table. And after decades of this, aren't really concerned with whose fault it is, whether it's because the Islamic Republic is subjected to sanctions unfairly, or whether it's because they mismanage the economy. They're not really interested in that debate. They're interested in having a normal life, which everybody deserves. And I think are increasingly able to sort of say to themselves, look, if this means if the regime has to go for this to happen, then fine, let the regime go. And that's why it becomes more and more unpopular. I think that's more or less where we are today.
Excellent.
We've got loads of loads of comments coming in.
Share,
Actually,
and then we'll bring in Kori.
There's loads of comments coming in, John. We have one which is from one of our viewers saying, this guy, John, is lying. We Iranians support Reza Pahlavi. He never said that he wants to be a king. He just wants to be in the transition phase. That's from one viewer. Then we have someone else who says, I feel Reza is starting a cult, people chanting and playing songs and quickly criticising anything we say about him. Then we have another viewer here who says, the Iranian regime, unlike personalised dictatorships like in Iraq or Libya, is a well-oiled structure of councils, elected leaders, all of whom shield the supreme leader. So targeting, blaming him is difficult. So there are many, many comments coming in.
The Iranian diaspora in full force online, it appears. I want to shift over to talk a little bit about external players, including the United States, and this is a great time to bring in our second guest, Kori, who is Senior Fellow and Director of Foreign and Defense Policy Studies at the American Enterprise Institute. Kori, thank you so much for joining us. I've been really wanting to talk to you on air for a very long time, so this is a great opportunity, and we're so grateful that you're joining us.
It's a great pleasure, my friend. I'm a huge fan both of your journalism and of your book.
Thank you. So this is a question for both of you. I want to talk about the American role, but what do we know about what Trump wants? I mean, John, as a reminder for those who've just joined, wrote the book on U.S.-Iran relations and the history of that. So we've got two amazing people who can weigh in on that. Kori, let's start with you. What do we know about what Trump wants? And perhaps that might be different than what some other players in the White House want.
So I think the honest answer is we have no idea what President Trump actually wants, because he doesn't have a foreign policy doctrine. He doesn't appear to have a strategy. He has a couple of fixed points, like that allies are a burden on the United States, that trade exports jobs, and that immigrants take jobs. Beyond that, he is captured by the last person he played golf with or talked to. And so I don't think there's easy predictability. I can say what he has said, which is that if the Iranian government continues to repress its people, that there will be hell to pay, that the U.S. will intervene. But it's not at all clear what that actually means. I mean, does that signify an attack on the Iranian leadership? If so, who and how? And I'm skeptical the U.S. has actionable intelligence that would make that effective. But also, as we're seeing in Venezuela, standoff military attacks aren't effective regime change. They don't take control of a situation. In the Iranian case, I think they could make it very much worse for the protesters by connecting the U.S. to the protest in a way that delegitimizes it or validates the crackdown by the government. The other thing I would say, Melissa, is that I think no matter how many voices there are in the cacophony of the Trump administration, the only one that matters is President Trump. And that's why his own unreliability and unpredictability is such a destabilizing and chaotic force internationally.
Since you mentioned what Trump said, let's actually run that soundbite because we do have him saying that, and then we'll go to John to react and weigh in on your thoughts.
And by the way, to all Iranian patriots, keep protesting, take over your institutions if possible, and save the name of the killers and the abusers that are abusing you. You're being very badly abused. If the numbers are right now, I hear 5 different sets of numbers. I hear numbers, look, 1 death is too much. But I hear much lower numbers, and then I hear much higher numbers. But I say save their names because they'll pay a very big price. And I've canceled all meetings with the Iranian officials until the senseless killing of protesters stops. And all I say to them is help is on its way.
Over to you, John. Your reaction and thoughts in terms of what you think the United States wants, what Trump wants.
Very interesting phrase. I've canceled all meetings with Iranian officials. I mean, I'm not sure which meetings he's talking about, but I think if he's trying to say, I mean, Trump has, from the very beginning, been someone who has indicated that he would like to talk, that he'd like to do a deal with Iran. And he has put out feelers, and including even just in the last few days. You know, if that's what he's referring to, then I guess he's trying to suggest that we're entering a different phase. You know, as your other, I mean, as Kori says very correctly, I mean, you know, it's impossible to read exactly what's in the mind of Donald Trump or what decision he's going to make. Statements like that, will they move the needle in Iran? I'm not really sure at this point. I think, you know, anyone who wants to come out and protest is coming out and protesting, and anyone who isn't. You know, I don't know that this idea of this famously, you know, unpredictable American president saying help is on the way and you know, we've got your back is going to somehow bring more people out onto the streets, I think is fanciful if you know anything about Iran, and if Iranians know anything about Donald Trump, and they do. And in fact, you know, I'm not one of these people who's going to sort of sit here and say the United States should not do anything because of its history of involvement or interference in Iranian affairs. But at the same time, Iranians have seen over the past couple of decades, not just in their own country, but in other parts of the region, what American support for uprisings and regime change really means and really looks like. And I think even the most diehard opponent of the Islamic Republic has a certain level of skepticism, at the very least, about what U.S. intentions, and particularly Donald Trump's intentions, might be.
Kori, you've worked for an administration and have insight into perhaps the kind of conversations that might be happening in terms of the White House. You alluded to this in terms of limitations, in terms of what the United States can do, but what might be considerations? What is the U.S. toolkit in terms of what, if they wanted to do something in Iran? And I know that's super vague because we don't know what the goals are of this administration, but what can be done, I suppose, that you're aware of?
So one useful thing that the United States government did during the 2009 protests was ensure that there was internet connectivity and that there were protected VPNs through which protesters could organize and could communicate. That's something incredibly useful that the U.S. government has the ability to do by ensuring that there's communications connectivity. The U.S. could also make it more difficult for the leadership of Iran to communicate. That's something useful they could do. But one important element of this equation is that the Trump administration has been systematically destroying these non-military elements of American power. Another thing the U.S. could be doing is back-channel messages through the governments of Qatar and others in the region, Turkey, who do have links to the Iranian regime, to lay out boundaries. But I think, as John rightly pointed out, the Trump administration is talking very tough about support to protesters in a way that carries both practical and ethical consequences. Encouraging people to rise up against a government this repressive is a morally suspect thing to do if you are not actually going to protect protesters.
I'm a little curious. First of all, any more comments?
Yeah, there's plenty of comments coming in.
Let's just put them in.
I'm going to just jump in. Hi, it's Pablo here. So it's one of the questions is I'm going to jump in with this one. It says, what's the position of other countries in the Middle East, especially Saudi Arabia, the UAE, about regime change in Iran? Is there a possibility of a chain reaction in the region in such a case? And one more, which is, of course, we're sitting here in Berlin, in the European Union. Why should the EU care about Iran? And isn't it America's and Israel's problem? That's from one of our viewers as well.
And I would actually just add and jump in here that I believe that there are reports that Qatar and Saudi Arabia is trying to dissuade the Americans from taking kinetic action. That is one report that's come out in the last 24 hours. I don't know who wants to take this first, but maybe I could. Kori, you're smiling, so let's just go to you. And then, John, you can prepare your thoughts.
They're both smiling, Melissa.
Yeah. Oh, they are? Yes. Okay. Well, Kori first.
I'm smiling because I'm glad I don't have to start with this question.
So I'll take the first question, which is how countries in the region are reacting. There is an enormous amount of anxiety about any kind of support for regime change because most governments in the region have domestic political opposition of their own, and they in no way want to suggest that regime change is an acceptable way of addressing it. So there's not a ton of enthusiasm, even though most countries in the region both fear and resent the Iranian government. But they don't want to give a whole lot of support, practical or political, to people in the streets wanting to overturn a government.
John?
It's also, yeah, I mean, look, it's also a question of hedging bets. I mean, I don't think that the Saudis or the Emiratis or any of the other regional powers and close American allies know which way this is going to end up either. There is a perfectly reasonable scenario in which the Islamic Republic ends up staying in power. And then if you're Saudi Arabia, Qatar, UAE, etc., do you really want to have deal with the awkwardness of having just been on record, pushing the American government for regime change in Iran? Of course not. And let's also remember that a lot of these regional powers, while it's true that they have had a historically very difficult relationship with the Islamic Republic, and would not probably shed a tear to see it go, also have improved their relationships with the Islamic Republic over the past 5 to 10 years, as there has been a growing vacuum of American leadership in the region. So I think all of those issues are playing in as well, and I think have a lot to do with why they're not saying more.
One thing that's very confusing to me personally is so many players in the region have been systematically working to weaken Iran in different ways. And it's almost looks like to me from the outside, be careful what you wish for, because now that Iran is, by many people's analysis, the weakest it's been in many decades, people kind of don't seem to know what to do about it and are just sitting back. I don't know if that's a correct interpretation, but it just seems weird to me from a policy perspective that, things have been done to weaken Iran, and now it's in this state, and it almost looks as if no one knows what they want next.
So I have a slightly different take on that, Melissa, which is I think Iran has been unquestionably weakened internationally. Their strategic depth had been arming, training, and funding and leading proxies to destabilize surrounding governments. That strategic depth has been collapsed. But I don't think that necessarily connects to the domestic challenges to the Iranian government. To the extent it does, it looks to me, I would defer to John on this, but it looks to me that to the extent it connects to the domestic protests, it's exasperation by Iranians over their economic and political domestic concerns, an exasperation that why did we spend all of this money on a nuclear weapons program or on these proxies instead of helping families put food on their table?
John, is that something that you agree with in terms of that assessment?
Sure. I mean, those who have been strongly opposed to the government for quite a number of years, as the economic situation has got worse, that has been a real line of criticism is, does spending money on the nuclear program or regional militias actually make a lot of sense when people are struggling to get by? At the same time, there has been consistently, and I haven't seen recent polls on this, but consistently fairly widespread support for the nuclear program in Iran. Less so for regional proxies. But for a lot of Iranians have bought the argument that a nuclear program of some kind, a civilian peaceful nuclear program, is a national right. And in fact, actually, polling often shows that Iranians even support a nuclear weapons program, by a smaller majority, but still a majority. Again, I haven't seen those polls within the last year or two, so I'd be curious how that might have changed. But it is true that for the regime itself, these have been two of its greatest sources of external strength, the kind of leverage, if you will, regional militias and the kind of nuclear program that makes external enemies think twice before trying to attack the Islamic Republic. The logic on both of those has simply broken down over the past 2 years, both with the weakening of regional proxies and with the American bombing of the nuclear program.
I want to stick with this topic of the economy because we're getting a lot of questions about this, and it's zooming out a little bit further from the region itself. We have one viewer here asking a comment, how much is Iran's economy dependent on China, and will China increase trade with Iran at the risk of other international relations? And also there are questions about Iran's relationship with China, with India, with Pakistan, and of course Russia.
That's a lot. Who wants to
That's
go
a lot.
first?
Who wants to jump in?
On the regional,
I'm just throwing out big questions here and hoping someone bites.
Kori,
So I'm sure John knows more about the Iranian economy than I do, but China is a major purchaser of Iranian oil. And it would actually take an enormous amount of effort to interdict or prevent the commercial sales and the transport of oil. One thing that I think has been demonstrated in Ukraine, in Venezuela, in Syria, and in Iran itself is that the so-called axis of authoritarians, Russia, China, North Korea, and Iran, isn't really a mutual defense pact. I mean, China basically sent thoughts and prayers as governments that they wanted to be bulwarks against American influence have been battered.
I think that's exactly right. And I would also add just on the Iranian economy, I think what's sometimes not fully appreciated is there is not a lot of leverage left in the West over the Iranian economy at this point. And the sheer battery of sanctions and economic warfare, I think that it's fair to call it that has been inflicted on the Islamic Republic over the past 20 years. Is actually very impressive. If you drill down into, it's a lot of it, the details are very wonky, but I mean, the tools that have been exercised, the way that the banking sector has been cut off, we have done almost everything that is humanly possible to collapse the Iranian economy. We in the West, I guess. And we've come a long way. The economy is very much on the ropes, and I think you could very much make the case that without that we wouldn't be here where we are, with the regime having to fight for its life. At the same time, what that also means is that we are also running out of options that don't include actual military warfare, which is why we're also seeing that kind of posture from Washington. This what we're seeing is the end result of decades, really, of a certain kind of logic in both countries and a certain kind of logic in Western, particularly in U.S. policy towards Iran. With a sort of hiatus, if you will, a sort of, during the Obama period where there was a negotiation over the nuclear agreement. But the idea that, I think the best example of that, best demonstration of that was Donald Trump's recent comments that he would place a 25% tariff on any country that does business with Iran. Leaving aside that that's very unrealistic and difficult to actually enforce, it's very telling because, the so-called idea of secondary sanctions, sanctioning countries that do business with Iran, started in the 1990s under the Clinton administration. And initially it was about oil, and those kinds of approaches were amplified under the Obama administration as well, the first term of the Obama administration. A lot of it has been congressionally driven, but a lot of it has also come from the White House, particularly under the first Trump administration as well. We've now made it almost impossible, realistically, for any of our allies to buy oil from Iran because they will find themselves heavily sanctioned. What we haven't tried is what Trump is talking about, which is simply cutting off business or increasing tariffs on countries that do any kind of business with Iran. That is a whole different level, and I don't think is quite as realistic. There's a reason we haven't done it because, frankly, that's most countries in the world. How are you going to start? Are you going to collapse the entire global economy because you're trying to collapse the Iranian economy? No. So again, both countries have found themselves in different ways with not a lot of options at this point. Other than these very tragic kind of crackdowns that the Iranian government is undertaking, or these kinds of military threats, and in the case of last summer, actual military action that the US is now taking.
I just want to jump in again because we've been scolded, all of us, by one of our viewers here for not answering the question about the European Union and what their role is, whether they should care about what's going on. And of course, while I'm at it, what power really does the EU have with regards to, say, both the economy and say, politically too?
So I did realize neither of us answered the question about the EU. I think the EU does have genuine interests in Iran's domestic crackdown and the regional consequences. First of all, they have a human rights interest. It is Europe's leading way that they engage with the rest of the world to be a regulator and a values power. Second, they have a very great interest in whether the Iranian government continues its nuclear program, because Iran getting a nuclear weapon would probably set off a cascade of nuclear proliferation to Saudi Arabia, to Turkey, to other countries. Third, the European governments and European populations have an interest in not having a repressive regime like the Iranian regime become more powerful regionally or internationally. And lastly, if a refugee crisis emerges from the political crackdown that the Iranian government is right now engaged in, that too will affect Europe, which is neuralgic about immigration just now.
John, I don't know if you have anything to add. I know Europe might not be in your wheelhouse, so you can take a pass, but I want to, of course, check in with you.
No, of course. I'm actually here in Lisbon at the moment, so for whatever that's worth. But look, the fact is that the Europeans have traditionally taken the approach they've traditionally taken to Iran is to play this kind of good cop, bad cop game, where they allow the Americans to kind of go in guns blazing with sort of cowboy diplomacy, while the Europeans try to kind of cajole the Iranians with a more diplomatic approach, as well as try to convince the Americans to take a more diplomatic approach. Although sometimes that's flipped. During the Obama administration, there were moments where, for example, the French government was actually pushing a much harder line than the American government. But typically, it's been that kind of good cop, bad cop role, because also the Europeans have always had much deeper economic ties with Iran. I mean, until relatively recently, a lot of their oil companies were still doing business in Iran. I think a lot of European companies have deep experience and knowledge and kind of interests in the idea of doing business with Iran, much more so than American companies that haven't done business with Iran since the 1970s, and would love to get back in there because they know it's a huge untapped market and with a lot of resources and so on and so forth. However, again, where is the good cop kind of playbook right now for Europe? What exactly are they supposed to be doing? Trying to convince the Iranian government not to crack down quite as hard on protesters because what? We'll be able to do some kind of economic deal with you. I don't think anyone in Iran is going to really believe that right now. Again, just as the American and Iranian governments, the Europeans don't have a strong middle way that they could be kind of carving out right now either. Plus, the European kind of political and defense establishment right now is very focused on other things. I can tell you, sitting here in Lisbon right now, what you hear a lot more concern about is Russia, Ukraine, the kind of abnegation of American responsibility or interest in that conflict and what that means for Europe. Everyone trying to meet their 5% GDP, defense targets and so on, and how we're going to handle Putin when, Donald Trump has basically looked the other way. Plus now this new and completely bizarre challenge of Denmark and Greenland. Those I think are the real priorities right now in kind of European foreign ministries. Not to say that they're not focused on Iran, but it's not like that they have a ton of great options with Iran either.
But you did mention Russia, and I actually think this might be a good time to talk about that because Russia and Iran have had a relationship. This has not been a good start of the year, I would say, for Russia. We're 14 days into 2026. In some ways, what's happening in our discussion here is connected a little bit to what happened in Venezuela, insofar as it is from Moscow's point of view. So I really want to talk a little bit about that, and I'd love both of your takes on that. Kori, why don't you explain it for those of our viewers who might not necessarily see the geopolitical connection? I want to take a step back. I mean, a lot of people have died in Iran, and each of those deaths, statistic, but there will be mothers in 60 years who will still have a hole in their heart that they will never get over. And then yet we're talking about this great powers game. That is also another layer to this story. But yes, for now, on Russia, what does this all mean in terms of Russia running out of its, frankly, friends in the world? Kori?
So it seems to me that you're right that it's not been a great start to the year for the Russian government because Ukraine continues to persevere. I mean, I love the way former British Defense Chief Admiral Tony Radakin put it, that if in February of 2022 you had put a snail on the Russian-Ukrainian border, that snail would have covered more ground into Ukraine than the Russian military has since that time. So Russia's failure to dominate Ukraine, the ease with which the American military pulled off a smash and grab kidnapping of Venezuela's head of state, the fact that the Russians attempted to prevent the U.S. from taking possession of an oil cargo transport. They had a submarine and other assets in the area who stood by and watched while the American military took possession of the tanker. The Russians are very quiet about what's going on in Iran. So the stripping away of Russian proxies is one geopolitical story. And I agree with you, Melissa, that that's definitely not good news from the Russian perspective. But what is good news for the Russian perspective is what appears to be a new Yalta, which is actually something Vladimir Putin had proposed to President Trump on a previous occasion, which is, U.S., you take the Western Hemisphere, we'll cede Cuba, we'll cede Venezuela, but you cede Europe to us, and maybe you cede Asia to the Chinese. That's a very good long-term outcome for Russia and China. And Donald Trump appears amenable to it given that he has backed off from a tough line on China, and he appears to have taken the Russian side in their invasion of Ukraine.
John?
I don't have much to add to that. Other than, I mean, yes, it's we do seem to be moving into this kind of spheres of influence approach, this kind of old school 19th century kind of diplomacy. What's of course worrying is that the world is much more interconnected than it was in the 19th century, and I don't know that it's going to be as simple as the United States doing the Western Hemisphere while Russia does a different part of the world. But no, look, it's absolutely correct that Russia has found itself with one strategic setback after another. I'm not an expert in this, but I mean, from what I know of the Russian, of the sort of philosophy of the Russian government, they seem to believe that they have more ability to withstand setbacks. That they have longer-term strategic patience than the United States, and in the long run, they're going to win this game because the U.S. is a declining power. I mean, where that fits in, we're a long way from Iran now, of course, in this conversation. But yeah, I don't think that Russia will be happy about what it's seeing in Iran. At the same time, as we said earlier, for none of these powers, China, Russia, etc., views Iran as a fundamental strategic ally. They're friends of convenience in a sort of anti-American loose coalition.
Any more
Also,
comments? Go ahead. Yes, Kori.
I add one other thing.
Yes.
The Russians actually took advantage of an Iranian niche capability, which is the production of Shahed drones. The Russians reversed engineered them and are making their own now, so collapsing the market for something that Iran was otherwise in a strong position to have an advantage as a security partner and an economic partner.
That's very interesting.
A lot of the questions that are coming in are actually more focused on, they're bringing it back to the regime change. Okay. Actually, that's sort of the. I'll just put one question to both of you. Actually, it says the trajectory of the regime in Iran over the past decade shows constant decline in every aspect. I mean, it's bringing in a lot of the elements that we've just been talking about, obviously internationally and also nationally. What goal do the rulers have to continue this trend? Why don't they just try to change direction? And of course, by that question, you can also say change direction, change friends, So I'm just going to put that to both of you and get your thoughts.
Kori, do you want to go first, or John?
John's the expert on the Iranian regime.
Yeah, John, over to you. And I know that you've talked about this in your book, that actually Iran's relationships with, for example, the United States was not always the way it has been. So
if we're talking about changing direction domestically, I think I probably already addressed that earlier, is that the Iranian government, if they feel that they've tried a few different approaches, they don't have a lot of great options. If we're talking about changing directions externally, that is much more challenging. I mean, it's just as challenging for the Iranian political establishment as it is for the American political establishment to fundamentally and unilaterally decide that it's going to take a different approach to this bilateral relationship. In both countries, you have deeply entrenched political establishments that fundamentally do not trust the other country and see everything as a zero-sum game. For the Iranians, you could say, look, they're in a much weaker position right now, so why don't they just capitulate? I mean, that's basically what that means, or at least how they will see it. It's easy for us, I think, sitting in the West to say, well, why don't they just decide to be friendly with the West? Their response to that would be, we've tried that. We've tried that within the maximum parameters of the logic of the Islamic Republic, which is to say, negotiate over the nuclear deal, allow our more reformist governments, when they're in power, to negotiate with the West. And every time we do that, the response from the West is more sanctions, more hardship, more threats, etc. We can argue about that, and I think to some extent we got a little bit unlucky with the fact that the nuclear deal took so long to negotiate, and then by the time it was in place, we were 3 years later, Donald Trump pulled out of the deal, and so it allowed hardliners to make that claim even more vocally and more credibly, that there's no point in negotiating with the West. They're just looking for our destruction and our capitulation. So that point of view has been much more on the rise within the Iranian political establishment over the past couple of years. given where we are today, I think still it's very hard for people to make the case that it's time to simply negotiate with the US, because the US has been quite open about the fact that it wants the complete capitulation of the Islamic Republic. It's no longer taking the approach that democratic administrations have taken in the past, that, look, we're not trying to bring about regime change, we're just trying to do a deal over the nuclear program and reduce sanctions in exchange for this. That's just simply not what the Trump administration is saying. So, if you're the Ayatollah, if you're some of his supporters, of course, your response is just to say, well, in response to that question would be, well, how change course? How exactly? They just want to completely destroy us. And there's a similar logic in the United States, which of course Dr. Schake is much more positioned to be able to comment on. But I think there's also a version of that in the American political establishment, which is that you simply don't. There's no point in negotiating with the Islamic Republic. They're just there to sow discord and instability and chaos, and they have to go.
I'm going to
I agree with.
Oh, go ahead. Yes.
I would add two quick points to John's very good analysis. The first is, historically, regimes get overthrown when they begin to be amenable to modification, right? It's when people get hopeful that change is possible that autocratic regimes tend to get overthrown. And the second thing I would say is that a dramatic change in course creates domestic winners and losers. And the big domestic winner of Iran's international isolation has been the way that the IRGC has become a major player in the economy, just as the Egyptian military controls a lot of the Egyptian economy. Increasingly, the isolation has created space for the IRGC to become major political actors. And that too is an inhibition to an opening to the West, because when they have to compete with actual Iranian businesses, they would be in a much less prestigious and a much less protected position.
We're getting near the.
I can just quick,
yes, please.
I know we're at the end, but if I can just very quickly jump in and say, I'm really glad that you brought up the. I'm really glad that you brought up the Revolutionary Guard Corps, because I think we should have talked about that and haven't. It's not being talked about nearly enough. I think a lot of people who are very fixated on regime change right now in Iran are underestimating the degree to which they could get the kind of regime change they really don't want. There is very much a potential here for a sort of Bonapartist script, if you like, where there's a strong man, a military response to this, where you have elements within the IRGC that say, you know what, the Islamic Republic seems to be out of answers and we need a tougher approach. So I think we also have to be very prudent and watchful for that kind of scenario as well.
Great. One last check on comments, and then I will give the guests an opportunity with a final thought.
Absolutely. There's been, as you can imagine, lots of comments, lots of different opinions. One opinion here from Rebecca Arnold-Sauer. I'm concerned the US doesn't care about the protesters. He just wants the country destabilized because it's Israel's security and for natural resources and bargaining chips. Just a thought. There's plenty of comments there saying that it's sad to see people thinking Trump actually cares about them. And then, of course, plenty of people saying the Iranian people have been oppressed for far too long. The radical leadership in Iran needs to go. We've many comments from that side as well. And then plenty of other comments as well saying that, asking the question of, who really is going to stand in and help Iranians in general, not just from the US, but also the EU. And then people who are also saying, who are not so negative about those in power as well in Iran. So
there you go. Kori and John, I want to give you an opportunity for final thoughts. Now, if you don't have a final thought, maybe a question from me might be what you hope happens next. That's kind of projection, but it's always nice to hear a little bit of a positive, if we can, that we can be hopeful about. So I will go with Kori, and then we'll have John with the last word.
So I would hope that the Iranian protests manage to persevere against the regime's crackdown, that it produces leaders who can unify the protesters and make political demands that they have the power to draw the regime into actual concessions rather than just a crackdown. But I do have to say, Melissa, I'm not particularly optimistic that that's the direction this is going. It looks to me like the regime is succeeding through brutality to crack the protests.
John.
Yeah, I'll just say I'm really not very hopeful. I mean, there are only three real scenarios for how this can go. One is a very dark and brutal crackdown that results in a lot of loss of life, and the Islamic Republic stays in place, which is just a more severe version of what we've had again and again over the past 15 years or so. There's a scenario in which in which things just kind of start to stabilize and not a lot more people are killed, but the Islamic Republic sort of stays in place and kind of staggers on to live another day. And then there's a third scenario, which I think is the one that a lot of people are hoping for, which is that somehow there is a peaceful transition to a democratic representative, Iran that fulfills the aspirations of its people. I have to be honest, I think that's the least likely scenario. I don't see something like that coming about, at least not without, potentially a very large amount of instability and disorder and pain and violence and bloodshed and, possibly going on, possibly years of that, quite honestly. So I'm sorry to end on a dour note, but I'm not hugely optimistic about where things are going.
Well, that is the honest thing, and we are really grateful for both of your times. Just as a reminder, John is the author of America and Iran, A History, 1720 to the President, and I highly recommend that book. So John Ghazvinian, thank you very much, and Kori Shake with the American Enterprise Institute. Really grateful to both of you. Thank you.
Thanks, John. Thanks, Kori.
So ending on a
bit of a downer.
A bit of a downer, but that is
Yeah.
the news, and sometimes that is the truth, unfortunately.
But also fascinating analysis there from both of our guests today. Really plenty of food for thought there. Really great.
I had
really
a lot
great
more
guests.
questions, actually, but we also know that we can't keep them for too long. But there's tons of
Absolutely.
questions on my page. And Cheri, what's been going on with what you've been monitoring?
That's very lively chat, I would say. Actually, I've seen a lot of cynicism about Trump's true intention to help Iran, and there are many people who think that Iranians shouldn't look to Trump for help in their movement. But there are also some hopeful comments there that they think that this time something will really change. So
Yeah, it's hard to say. I mean, the number of times that John kind of said Iran was on the ropes,
Yeah.
And so then what happens next?
It
Anyways.
was interesting what he said there. And I mean, also, the comments as well from what John was saying is that there is just, a plethora of opinions on this topic within Iran and, of course, outside Iran. So, I mean, we're really seeing that here.
Seeing that in the comments as well.
Absolutely. Will I bring in the poll?
Yeah.
Oh, yeah. Okay, so we have closed the poll, and let me just repeat the question. Today we asked which factor could be key in toppling Iran's clerical rulers. 50% goes to U.S. military intervention.
Wow.
25% says more street protests. 21% says the regime will cling to power, and 4% says pressure from exiled Iranians.
All right. Okay. Is that a surprise to you guys?
Yeah.
No, I would guess that a lot of people are expecting something from the United States after what Trump has put out.
But as Kori said, so unpredictable.
It's very unpredictable, and he might not even do anything. And that's the wild thing about all of this.
Yeah.
All right. Well, thank you very much to everyone who's joined us. We hope you've learned a thing or two. We're always grateful for your time, and we love having you on News Desk.
Absolutely. And of course, we'll be here again next week. Don't forget to tune in to the DW YouTube community channel on Tuesday, so 24 hours before the show goes to air first time. And you'll see what our topic is.
Yeah.
And leave us your comments, of course, as always, and questions.
Have a good day. Thank you very much, and bye-bye.
Take care.